Hey, how are you? Welcome back to Magic the Gathering. Today we're going to be talking about a mid-range Oni Anvil Sacrifice Weatherlight deck. Which sounds really weird when you say it like that, but I promise it'll make sense as we go. Let's talk about the number one and number two stars of the deck, the Oni Cult Anvil and Weatherlight Completed. If you don't know what Weatherlight Completed does, it is a legendary artifact vehicle that is uncrewable. There is no crew to it. But whenever a creature you control dies, it gets a counter on it. If it has 4 or more counters, it then becomes a Phyrexian creature, which means it is a 5/5 flyer after 4 creatures have died when Weatherlight is on board. When it has 7 counters on it, if a creature dies, you draw a card. If it has less than 7 counters on it, when a creature dies, you scry. Meaning that this is a 2-drop that will allow you to scry when your creatures die, which, hey, that's crazy. Oni Cult Anvil looks to sacrifice creatures. And draw when creatures die. Hey, that's crazy. Oni Cult Anvil likes to sacrifice creatures. Combine that with some powerhouses in the meta, such as Obnixilis the Adversary, something that makes a bunch of tiny little tokens that can be a bother to your opponent, and forces your opponent to either get drained for 2 life or to discard a card. Very useful. Combine that with Shielder to the Apocalypse, a card that allows you to gain life when you draw and forces your opponent to answer it, otherwise they will slowly be drained to death by its forcibly making them lose 2 life on their upkeep every time. You got a recipe for a pretty powerful deck. Let's talk about the other powerhouses. Fable of the Mirror Breaker. Really strong saga. Makes a 2/2 shaman who creates treasures when it attacks. Allows you to loot through up to 2 cards if you choose. And then makes Reflections of Kiki-Jiki, which is an enchantment that for 1 in a tap, it will copy anything you have on board. Very useful when you're trying to sacrifice or just get creatures you control killed. It only targets non-legendaries, though, so it cannot target Shieldred or Weatherlight. That is something that you should probably keep in mind. If you're planning on making 7 Weatherlights drawing your deck type thing, it doesn't work like that. And the copies that die from Kiki-Jiki, if they don't die to combat damage, they get exiled. Right? No, I stand corrected. It just says sacrifice it at the beginning of your next end step, which means it does proc Weatherlight. I apologize. I misread the card when I was prepping for this video. Kiki-Jiki has a really good synergy with Weatherlight Completed, which is incredibly good. Other powerhouses in the deck, Tenacious Underdog, one of the best 2-drops in black right now. Can come back from the graveyard, be a cursive threat if your opponent doesn't exile it. Paying 2 life for it doesn't matter as much when you're getting Weatherlight procs and Shieldred procs from the draw, meaning that you pay 2 life, but then you sacrifice it at your up end step, and Shieldred basically refunds you that life if she's on field. Very useful. The 2 artifact creators in the deck are Bloodtithe Harvester and Valdaran Epicure. You summon them and they make blood tokens, which can either be used for Bloodtithe Harvester's effect, which is very nice, or can be sacrificed to Oni Cult Anvil to get the engine rolling. Removal spells, we have Infernal Grasp and Voltage Surge, both kind of self-explanatory and pretty good. Voltage Surge doesn't typically get to be played for 4. You might consider replacing it with a Flame Blast Bolt, depending on the matchup, but I like it at the moment because it doesn't really cost me too much, and it can go up to 4 damage to take out, say, a Haughty Djinn. Soul Transfer, another very powerful card in the deck, but it's a one-of because you don't really need multiple Soul Transfers in this deck. You don't really need to be pulling stuff out of the graveyard super often because you run 4 copies of Shieldred because she's that good. Exiling target creature or planeswalker can be very useful, though, inside of matchups where you need to take care of a planeswalker and the board state is kind of stalled, and you don't want to, sacrifice your Weatherlight that has 7 counters on it to just try and kill a planeswalker, so you just try and Soul Transfer it and see what your opponent does. Pretty powerful card, can get back Shieldred if you so choose, but it's one of because I don't think you need to play it that often. Same for Cruelty of Gix. Really powerful enchantment saga. Really powerful. It's Hand Hate. It is a tutor effect for 3 life, and then put a target creature from a graveyard. You hear that? The creature you made your opponent discard in step 1. You can steal it. Really good if your opponent is playing a creature-heavy deck that has some really powerful creatures like, say, I don't know, Titan of Industry, Sarah Paragon, anything like that. Cruelty of Gix, it can grab those things back for you. Rafine, Joda. Okay, Joda's not as common as Rafine and Sarah Paragon, but you get the idea. It's very useful. But because that's not the core idea of the deck, it's kind of a one-off. I had room to fit a couple of powerful cards like that in the deck, so I decided to do it. because my mana base can be very low to the ground because the entire deck is CMC 3 or less, except Shieldred. She's your only 4-drop. Besides Gix. So, 5 total cards in a 60-card deck that are above CMC 3 means that we could afford to cut a lot of lands. Speaking of lands, I highly recommend running 4 Haunted Ridges, not 3, but I personally just don't have them in my collection. I'm running 2 Bloodfell Caves, 2 Sulphurous Springs. You could probably swap to 4 copies of each of these dual lands. However, that means you have 8 lands that come into play tapped on turn 1. So I might not recommend that. But it's kind of up to you, dear viewer. I personally recommend, if you have the wild cards? Is that the term? God, I think so. If you have the cards for it, run 4 Sulphurous Springs, run 4 Haunted Ridges, run 4 Bloodfell Caves. Making 12 of your lands dual lands means that you never really have mana problems anymore inside of a deck whose mana base is typically 23 lands. When half of your lands can be tapped for either color, it's very, very useful. However, do be cautious about Sulphurous Springs draining you out before you have a chance to get your own drain going with Oni Cult, Ob, and Shieldred. Bloodfell Caves is very slow, so if you draw it on turn 3 or 4, it comes in tapped and that's a problem. Haunted Ridge, however, doesn't have that problem, but it always comes into play tapped early for no additional benefit, so viewer discretion advised, I suppose. But yeah, this is the deck. I actually feel like I didn't talk enough about Ob Nixilis. If I didn't talk about him at all, that's because I've recorded this 2 times now. Because I flubbed the first one. Haha, we do these live. I want to talk about him. If this is the second time this video, I apologize. If not, then go me. He's really powerful. He drains your opponent for 2 life, essentially. If you have a Devil Token on the field, he can be cast with a casualty effect, meaning that you can sacrifice something and get him out on board. Hey, you want to know what's really great to sacrifice to Ob Nixilis? Bloodtithe Harvester, Tenacious Underdog. Want to know what sacrificing those does? Feeds the Weatherlight completed. And then you get him out on board, you make a bunch of tiny little devil tokens, you get a really wide board state using Oni Cult Anvil to make a bunch of little guys, you start draining your opponent for 2 life per turn unless they are discarding cards, in which case then you have a big advantage. He's got a lot of value right now, and I feel like he slots into this deck really, really well because he both sacrifices stuff very well, and he does the whole drain life thing, which you're already doing anyways through Oni Cult, Anvil, and Shieldred. I've had a lot of fun with this deck. It is it's a very fast mid-range deck, but it can take a few turns to get the engine rolling. So while it can be really threatening early through, say, turn 2 Bloodtithe into turn 3 Ob Nixilis into turn 4 Shieldred, you can get a really big everything going out if you get a really lucky draw. You can also play late into the grindy games by having Weatherlight completed constantly drawing you cards with a stalled board state, starring Shieldred and then like 7 little 1/1s from Oni Cult Anvil, and then playing Fable of the Mirror Breaker to pressure your opponent to take care of the Fable, because otherwise you're just going to infinitely copy one of your Fables to infinitely copy Bloodtithe Harvesters to sack to a bunch of Oni Cult Anvils. You get the idea. It plays very mid-rangey, even if it is a very fast deck in terms of low CMC across the board. So that is viewer discretion advised again. I've been having a lot of fun with this. I think it's a great deck because, honestly, it's basically Rakdos mid-range, but we included Oni Cult Anvil and Weatherlight as an additional win con for the grindier matchups. Something else that I highly recommend you include is Braids. I don't own Braids, and I didn't feel like crafting Braids for this deck because I felt like it was a little excessive. I still have it. I apologize. Braids of Risen Nightmare. She's really good. At the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice something. If you do, each opponent may sacrifice a permanent with it. Shares a card type with it. For each opponent who doesn't, that player loses 2 life and you draw. Another draw engine, a way to force your opponent to start sacrificing stuff. However, this deck is already very expensive with the wild cards. 4 rares for Tenacious Underdog, 3 mythics for Weatherlight, 4 more rares for Fable, another rare for Soul Transfer, 4 mythics for Ob, 4 mythics for Shieldred, another rare for Cruelty of Gix, rares for Haunted Ridge and Sulphurous Springs. Like, this is a very rare heavy deck in terms of the powerful cards in it. So I left out Braids. I think Braids would be a wonderful fit if I get the wild cards or just get copies of her. I'll probably slot her in and probably phase out something. Maybe phase out a Shieldred or two. Maybe phase out an Ob or two. But she's probably the only other thing that I would include in this. She's a legendary creature, though, so she does have that negative synergy with Fable of the Mirror Breaker. However, you know, she's really powerful. Free card draw is always good in a mid-range grind slog fest, especially one that'll make your opponent sacrifice stuff. Highly recommended, even if I couldn't fit it in my variant. Deck list should be in the description below the video. Thanks for hanging out and watching. Hope you liked it. Like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff, and I hope to catch you in the next one.